So, uh, so we're going to learn together one of my very favorite texts today. What I think of really is one of my core texts. Those texts that sit inside me and that changed me the first time I encountered them and continue to reverberate. This month, the theme of University Series is, as just said a minute ago, Rabbi's Choice, which is to say whatever anyone wants to teach about that week is what they're teaching about that week, which I guess is what we do when we can't come up with a theme that we all agree on. So I decided to teach David Hartman's, or hoping that we can all learn together, David Hartman's Auschwitz or Sinai. Has anyone read this text before? No one. Okay, this is very exciting. I'm really excited to introduce this text to all of you. So first, a little bit of background about David Hartman. I know if we've studied together at all, you've heard me talk about the Hartman Institute, I'm sure. I had a fellowship there that brought me there each summer in Jerusalem for 4 years, and each winter for a week, each summer for a month, learning online in between. It's the most significant and profound learning I've done really in any kind of institution. So David Hartman was an American Orthodox rabbi, really came out of the ultra-Orthodox world at one moment. He became very involved with Rav Soloveitchik. Is that a name that means anything to anyone, or at least rings a bell? No. Soloveitchik is the most significant Orthodox rabbi of the last 50 years. I can probably say that, with maybe Schneerson of Chabad being the other one. Soloveitchik is so important, particularly to the religious Zionist world and the non-ultra-Orthodox Orthodox world, that he's simply called the Rav. Right, the rabbi in that sense. Let me close this door so I can hear my kids a little less. I don't know if you hear them, but I hear their cartoons. So David Hartman was one of Soloveitchik's best, most significant students until David Hartman decided to go get a PhD in philosophy. And going to get a secular PhD was a bridge too far, and he ended up being cut off by Soloveitchik. So Hartman gets his PhD in philosophy, and eventually, after the 67 war, after the Six-Day War, decides to move to Israel, which had been a long dream of his. There's a great line, which I think, or a great story, which to me says a lot about his personality, that he was dreaming of the shuk during Pesach, during Passover. Shuk, the outdoor open markets that are all over. Think Soulard on steroids, and it's in every city. He talks about how he imagined that in Israel, and this was why he believed Israel was so important, that you'd go to the shuk during Pesach, and everyone would be talking about the nature of freedom and what freedom looks like in this world and how to bring more freedom to our world. And what he discovered instead is when you go to the shuk during Pesach, everyone's talking about which matzah is the most kosher. So I think you get a sense of David Hartman from that story, and also maybe a sense of Orthodox religious life in Israel from that story as well. So he goes to Israel. He ends up founding the Shalom Hartman Institute, named after his father, Shalom Hartman, with the express goal of finding and nurturing the next Maimonides, the next brilliant thinker, or the generations of brilliant thinkers. So all sorts of different programs that they run around that. Okay, that's just some quick and dirty background about who David Hartman was before we dig into this story. Any questions or thoughts or anything before we look at the text?
Is he alive?
He died during the first year of my fellowship, which would have been 2012, 2013, something like that. It's now run by his son, Daniel Hartman, in Jerusalem side, and Yehuda Kurtzer, the son of the former American ambassador to Israel in the American side. Yehuda's one of the most brilliant human beings I know. And Daniel is a visionary who turned the Hartman Institute into the premier postdoc for rabbis. Maybe that's the best way to think of it. In addition, there's a gathering every summer of about 200 rabbis who come to Jerusalem from across the denominational spectrum to study together at Hartman with some of the very best teachers that there are in the Jewish world today. And it's pretty amazing just to sit down and argue in a good way, right, in a positive Jewish way, with Orthodox rabbis and Maharats and conservative rabbis and radical humanists, and for everyone to sit with the same texts and sort of come to it with the same authenticity. And that's a big part of Hartman's approach, that we can't always pray together. We often can't even eat together, right, because of kashrut and things like this. But what we can always do is we can study together. And that was fundamentally the center of Jewish life, as he saw it, was the Beit Midrash, the study house. Okay. The last piece of context before we dig into this text is this is a text, this is an essay, Auschwitz or Sinai, that was written in 1982. Does anyone know anything or remember anything about what was going on in Israel in 82? So this was the period of the Lebanon Wars. And the Lebanon Wars are often called or thought of in Israel as Israel's Vietnam, in the sense that, first of all, it was a war that Israel, in some readings, maybe lost. They certainly didn't win, right? It wasn't clear what a win would be in the war. It was one of these long, drawn-out kind of things. Like Vietnam. It was also very much like Vietnam, the first time that Israel had been involved in a war that wasn't immediately existential in nature, right? In 48, in the Wars of Independence, if Israel lost, it was the end of Israel and probably the genocide of the Jewish people living there. Same was true of all of those wars in the 50s, the Wars of Independence, really, you can think of it. Certainly in 67 with the Six-Day War, it's not how it turned out, but still had that existential piece to it. 73 with the Yom Kippur War, absolutely was as close as Israel has gotten to that brink. But 82 with Lebanon was not that. It was a convoluted geopolitical kind of war with a geopolitical rationalization, much like Vietnam. And much like Vietnam, it sparked an anti-war movement in Israel. It sparked a protest movement. There were internal accusations against Israel of having committed war crimes. There's the famous Sabra and Shatila massacres that occur. And then the internal Israeli report, it's not the Goldstone report, it's the, I'm forgetting what it's called. It's really a remarkable document that comes out afterwards, where this Israeli report, really, I mean, incredibly admirable document, comes out and says, look, international law is pretty clear that we are not to blame here, but Jewish ethical ideas say that absolutely we are to blame, and we need to deal with that tshuva as a society, regardless of what the international law says. Really just a remarkable, inspiring moment of introspection from a state, right? And certainly political states are not famous for their moments of introspection. Okay, that's all of the context. Lebanon is a context in Israel because that's when this was written in 1982, and David Hartman is a background. Any questions there before we just jump in? Okay, here we go. Let me share this link if anyone wants to have it up on your own. I'm going to screen share this, but if you'd like it on your own, this is a Google Doc that I copied it into, though if I'm sharing a link, I may as well give you the actual link from Hartman's website. Okay, so there are the two links. And now we screen share. Okay, is there someone who, we got a lot of text we're going to go through and we're going to stop and talk, but is there someone who's up for reading? Nancy, please. And I can make this larger if that helps.
No, you're good. Okay. So you want me to just keep going until you stop me, or what?
I'll stop you. Don't you worry. Yep.
There is a healthy spirit of serious self-evaluation and criticism in the land today. The triumphant ecstasy of the Six-Day War no longer dominates the consciousness of many Israelis.
Okay, pause. This is an important thing to understand in Israeli culture, and truthfully American Jewish culture too. What is this idea of the triumphant ecstasy of the Six-Day War? Why was the Six-Day War so triumphant? Triumphalist also, I think.
Because
it
Israel,
ended on Sabbath?
Oops, sorry, say that again, Rody.
Because it ended for the Sabbath?
Ended for the Sabbath. Nice. I like that. Nancy?
because Israel thought they won.
Yeah, I mean, Israel did, at least we can talk about the implications of the Six-Day War for Israel long-term, right? In some ways, we're still living in the implications of the Six-Day War. But for the moment, the Six-Day War was miraculous, right? It was a moment where certainly those who were religious Zionism is a movement that sees the Jewish state as having intrinsic religious value, as being a part of a messianic moment or messianic process. Right? Religious Zionists looked at the Six-Day War when it looked like we were going to be wiped off the face of the earth. And instead, we ended up with the West Bank and Gaza and the entire Sinai Peninsula, right? And the Golan in the north, and had destroyed every Arab air force before they got off the ground, right? And significantly, the sacred holy sites of Judaism for the first time in 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years, came under the political sovereignty of a Jewish nation, right? The Kotel, the Temple Mount, significantly in Hebron, Machpelah, the ancient burial site. All of these became under Jewish control, under Israeli control for the very first time. And so it felt miraculous, truly miraculous. Secular people were talking about it in miraculous terms. And in the United States, it's true as well, by the way. Sociologists of the American Jewish experience generally point to 67 war, the Six-Day War, as being the turning point. Clearly, it was a long process, but as being the turning point between an American Judaism that was either broadly anti-Zionist or a-Zionist by that point, indifferent to Zionism, to post-67 war in American Judaism that actually centered proxy Israeli identity within American Jewish identity, right? That turned American Jewish identity for really a generation or more into Israelism and Holocaustism. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there? Okay, so what he's saying is we've got some distance from that ecstatic moment and an opportunity to be reflective. So let's keep going, and you can skip the italic parts. I tried to take out some of the things that I didn't think we need.
In retrospect, the jubilant sense of victory created by the Six-Day War was a mixed blessing. Besides the positive effect of awakening the Jewish world to the centrality and importance of Israel, it also gave rise to national self-adulation and hubris.
Okay, which, right, this is, in some ways, he's talking about the rise of religious Zionism. And if you want to learn more about that, Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Like Dreamers, is the masterwork. Okay, let's keep going in the non-italicized.
In the Judaic tradition, belief in renewal resulted from respect for mature and intelligent self-criticism. Eshbon, I'm not good at as
No, you're good.
Eshbon,
Hanefesh.
self-examination is a necessary condition for teshuvah, repentance and renewal. Honesty to oneself and to others is a precondition for authentic human growth and creativity. Self-praise and adulation are deceptive and lead to moral sloppiness and to reveling in the status quo.
Hold on, I love that sentence. Self-praise and adulation are deceptive and lead to moral sloppiness and to reveling in the status quo. Keep going, sorry.
Breakthroughs in the human spirit are facilitated by the courage to admit to moral failures.
Okay, nothing terribly radical here, but anything stand out to anyone? Any observations, or anyone want to summarize what he's saying? Okay, let's keep going then.
One of the fundamental issues facing the new spirit of maturity in Israel is, should Auschwitz or Sinai be the orienting category shaping our understanding of the rebirth of the state of Israel? There are important differences resulting from the relative emphasis we place on these two models.
Okay, so he's about to hold up Auschwitz and Sinai as lenses that we see our own experience in the Jewish world through. Orienting, what does he call them? Orienting categories. Throw out some of the things you associate with those words. He's going to go ahead and define each of these as categories and ideas for us. One thing I do want to point out is I actually think it's a little chutzpahdik for him to be using Auschwitz as a metaphor, particularly in 1982. Right, that's pretty close to the Holocaust for Auschwitz to be metaphor rather than reality. And he spoke of that late in his life, his regret for not taking the Holocaust more centrally. He took it seriously, but not centrally.
Do you think that's because he was younger? I mean, like, it wasn't his generation, it was his parents or his grandparents? I don't know how old he is.
Well, he died at the age of 80 or so 5 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that. So he was certainly in the shadow of the Holocaust. He was alive during it, though not over there. Yep. Let's keep going.
In the 20th century, we have again become a traumatized nation. The ugly demonic forces of anti-Semitism have horrified our sensibilities. We can never forget the destruction of millions of Jews in World War II. Many, therefore, justify and interpret the significance of our rebirth in terms of Jewish suffering and persecution.
Okay. Any thoughts on what that means or what that looks like in the Jewish community? To interpret the significance of our rebirth, or even to interpret the Jewish experience primarily through lenses of Jewish suffering and persecution?
The bottom line would be never forget, I think, what he's trying to say on this.
Yeah. That's really good, Paul, right? Like that there is a certain kind of Judaism where the central value of Judaism is the remembrance of the Holocaust, and that dictates everything else. Nice. Let's read this next paragraph too. I think he's going to detail it a little.
One often hears in speeches in the Knesset and at the UJA
Federation
fundraising dinners phrases such as, "Never again will we be vulnerable. Never again will we expose our lives to the ugly political forces in the world. Our powerful army has eliminated the need to beg for pity and compassion from the nations of the world."
And keep going, please.
While I respect and share in the anguish expressed in these sentiments, I believe it is destructive to make the Holocaust the dominant organizing category of modern Jewish history and of our national renewal and rebirth. It is both politically and morally dangerous for our nation to perceive itself essentially as the suffering remnant of the Holocaust. It is childish and often vulgar to attempt to demonstrate how the Jewish people's suffering is unique in history.
Okay, what's his broader point here? Anyone have a sense?
I mean, if when he's going back to the 1967 war and the triumphalism, and then he's saying, okay, the Holocaust we can't forget. We're now victorious, and yet then he comes back and says, well, maybe that's a little too arrogant. I mean, that's what.
Yeah, Lisa and Stan.
Well, yeah, the other, I suppose, idea that the Holocaust is it happened in the mid of the century and so on and so forth. But as we learned recently, and some of us knew about more recently, but has become more like during World War I, the Armenian massacre, and it's one of many that has occurred. So making the Holocaust the central bedrock of the religion, I think yeah, it's sort of misleading and it's dangerous.
Yeah, and morally blinding, he's even saying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's not just talking about the literal Holocaust here. He's also, and I see that there's chats, I'll look at those in a second. He's not just talking about the literal Holocaust here. He's also talking about a Judaism that centers the experience of anti-Semitism and persecution within Jewish identity, right? And I think we've all encountered this. Think about, I remember after the awful tragedy that happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, that awful shooting.
Right.
There was a national sort of push, go to synagogue this next week, because that's how we will push back against the Tree of Life shooter. That's how we push back against anti-Semitism. And I remember Randy Fleischer in particular was really offended by this, that anti-Semitism and that the awful things that other people do to us should never be the reasons that we do Jewish. That should never be the center of our identity, that our persecution becomes a persecution complex when that happens.
Right.
You know, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think the other thing is, I think there's real danger in seeing oneself as the victim all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the flip side of the moral arrogance, is that if you see yourself as the victim all the time, then I think you tend to hold yourself to less stringent standards of how to behave.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, that exactly dovetails with what I was going to say. Is it feels like right now there's almost a competition for who's the most persecuted, and that just seems counterproductive.
Yeah, I think that interesting, Nancy, to read it through contemporary culture like that. Yeah, absolutely. So backing away for a moment, remembering that Hartman's a PhD in philosophy, as well as being an Orthodox ordained rabbi. This category of Auschwitz, he's talking about ethics here. Because if you look at existing within Auschwitz, the only possible ethical response is survival, right? Do what you have to survive is the ethic that exists when you are in Auschwitz. Auschwitz is not about creating the sort of society that you should live in or that we all should, right? That is not the ethical response to Auschwitz. When you are in a moment of true existential crisis where your reality, your life, your continued existence is on the line, the ethical response that Judaism certainly demands is that you work to survive yourself. But those are the limits of the ethics of Auschwitz. So let's hold on to that. Let's keep going.
Our bodies have painful, oops, sorry. Were we, nonetheless, okay. Oops. Okay.
You know, start with nonetheless, go ahead.
Okay. Nonetheless, there are individuals obsessed with the trauma of the Holocaust who proclaim that no one can judge the Jewish people. No nation has the right to call us to moral judgment. We need not take the moral criticism of the world seriously because the uniqueness of our suffering places us above the moral judgment of an immoral world.
I assume we've all heard some variation of that within Jewish spaces, right? Some variation on this idea.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, keep going, please.
Those who make such statements judge others, but refuse to be judged. In so doing, a basic Judaic principle is violated. No one may judge if they refuse to be judged himself. Although it is right to appreciate the dignity that comes with power and statehood, with freedom from the inconsistent and fragile goodwill of the nations of the world, it is a serious mistake to allow the trauma of Jewish suffering to be the exclusive frame of reference for understanding our national renaissance.
Right? Think about how often the case for Israel, both in terms of its creation and contemporary case, is framed around existential crisis, Jewish suffering, and the unique place of Jewish suffering. And that is what he's pushing against, is that discourse. Again, back in 1982. And Nancy, if you get tired of reading and want to tag out, just say so.
I'm okay, but if somebody else wants to take over, that's fine too.
Please.
Israel is not only a response to modern anti-Semitism, but is above all a modern expression of the eternal Sinai covenant that has shaped Jewish consciousness throughout the millennia. It was not Hitler who brought us back to Zion, but rather belief in the eternal validity of the Sinai covenant. One need not visit Yad Vashem in order to understand our love for Jerusalem. It is dangerous to our growth as a healthy people if the memory of Auschwitz becomes a substitute for Sinai.
Okay, who has been to Yad Vashem? Anyone here? The Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem? Rudy has been? No. It's Israelis remember the Holocaust very differently than American Jews do. The first thing to say is that for the better part of a generation, maybe 2 generations, the general approach to Holocaust survivors was something akin to shame. Right? In the United States, we've by and large treated Holocaust survivors as saints at some level. That's not quite the right word, but we have held them apart as something special. And I'm not even sure how to frame it. Anyone have a thought on how to frame how we talk about and have treated? Certainly with deep respect and reverence. Maybe those are the words. In Israel, however, the Holocaust went against this notion of the new Jew and of the way that we wanted Jews to be, which was powerful and responsible for ourselves. And so there was this shame that was often applied early on to Holocaust survivors. It has mostly changed today, right? Because there was this view that they went quietly into the night like sheep. So, for instance, the only place in the original Yad Vashem that mentioned the 6 million is a room that you're not allowed to speak in. I forget the exact percentage, but it's something like over 60%, 60 of the original Yad Vashem was dedicated to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Right, that was the version of the Holocaust that was told. That was the Holocaust mythology that was told, as opposed to the American mythology. One of the other fundamental differences is that American Jews, by and large, have internalized the notion of never again, as meaning never again shall we allow this sort of ethnic cleansing genocide to happen to anyone. And in Israel, by and large, never again has been internalized as never again will we allow this to happen to Jews. So it's just very different responses, and I think understandable difference, but different responses culturally to the experience of the Holocaust. Okay, did that make sense?
Do you think that was because, Israelis at the time were so proud of building Israel? I mean, they had the kibbutzes, they had, they were building this new state out of nothing. They were reclaiming the desert. And so they were full of their own agency, their own sort of power. And maybe the Holocaust, in the sense of people being shepherded into these, trains and camps just seemed too passive to them, even though people didn't have a voice.
Yeah, I think exactly, Nancy. Right, it's very much a cultural thing. So the piece I mentioned about Yad Vashem is because Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, ends with a lookout onto modern Jerusalem. Dramatic, powerful lookout onto modern Jerusalem. So you go through this awful story of degradation of the Holocaust, and it ends with this note of hope and redemption, of looking out into Israel, a hope and redemption that I've always found problematic, right? I'm not comfortable talking about silver linings to the Holocaust. Nor do I think framing Israel as the redemption that came at the end of the Holocaust is healthy. right? Israel is not redemptive to any of the 6 million human beings who were murdered in the Holocaust, right? Israel is not redemptive to the 1 million children who were murdered in the Holocaust. It's only in our own story that it becomes redemptive, and that's really a use of the Holocaust for our own narratives. Does that make sense?
It does, definitely does. But it's kind of funny how so late in this book that he mentioned Hitler. I mean, and I know he's used Auschwitz a lot earlier, but it's a Hitler thing. I'm not going to make it into today's political field, but back then, it wasn't Hitler that brought in the Zionism into it.
Right, there you go.
Or Auschwitz.
The other piece that David Hartman is invested in, it's not just in terms of our discourse, it's also, he's quite invested in pushing back against a notion that sees Israel as being the political entity of Israel as being a byproduct of the Holocaust. He traces a much broader and longer story of how Israel comes to be that is not about the Holocaust for exactly that reason. Okay, so Nancy, if you don't mind, from there.
Sorry. Yeah. Let's see. The model of Sinai awakens the Jewish people to the awesome responsibility of becoming a holy people. At Sinai, we discover the absolute demand of God. We discover who we are by what we do. Sinai calls us to action, to moral awakening, to living constantly with challenges of building a moral and just society, which mirrors the kingdom of God in history. Sinai creates humility and openness to demands of self-transcendence. In this respect, it is the antithesis of the moral narcissism that can result from suffering and from viewing oneself as a victim.
So first of all, what an intense line there, right? What a call out.
Well,
The antithesis of the moral narcissism that can result from suffering and from viewing oneself as a victim.
wow.
That's how he spoke too. When I have learned from him, he had no tolerance for anyone who said anything that didn't make perfect rational sense. He would push right back at you and tell you were wrong very quickly, no matter who you were. Okay, let's keep going.
The centrality of mitzvah in Judaism shatters egocentricity and demands of the Jew that they judge themselves by the way they act and not by mystical myths regarding the purity or uniqueness of the Jewish soul. Oh gosh.
Naaseh v'nishma.
Naaseh v'nishma, we will do and we will understand, was the response of our people at Sinai. We understand ourselves through our doing. Sinai does not tell us about the moral purity of the Jewish nation, but about the significance of aspiring to live by the commandments. Sinai permanently exposes the Jewish people to prophetic aspirations and judgments. Jews were never frightened for the failure to implement covenantal responsibilities. Immediately after the account of the revelation at Sinai, we are reminded of Israel's unfaithfulness to the covenant in the vivid description of the golden calf incidents. Sinai teaches us there is no meaning to election without judgment. There are no privileges without demands.
Okay, so we have to throw out a little bit of what we may think of with the word Sinai. I don't know about you, but I get a very Charlton Heston kind of image in my head when I think Sinai. Right, Sinai again here is a metaphor. If Auschwitz is the ethics and the ethical obligations that emerge from moments of genuine existential threat, Sinai are the moral obligations that emerge when you have power. Right? When you have power, think about Sinai for a moment, right? The giving of the Torah is not the moment that we have a society. It's the moment that we have a vision for the way that society should be. Sinai is the moment where we are given our mission in the world, presented with a vision for the way, an aspirational vision for the way the world should be, and then told to go get to work building it. Right? Very different from the ethics that emerge in a moment of existential crisis and existential threat. Thoughts here? Okay, let's read a little more.
Sinai requires of the Jew that they believe in the possibility of integrating the moral seriousness of the prophet with the realism and political judgment of the statesman. Politics and morality were united when Israel was born as a nation at Sinai. Sinai prohibits the Jewish people from ever abandoning the effort of creating a shared moral language with the nations of the world. The rebirth of Israel can be viewed as a return to the fullness of the Sinai covenant, to Judaism as a way of life. The moral and spiritual aspirations of the Jewish tradition were not meant to be realized in Sabbath sermons or by messianic dreamers who wait passively on the margins of society for redemption to break miraculously into history. Torah study is not a substitute for actual life, nor are prayer and the synagogue escapes from the ambiguities and complexities of political life.
So Aleph Bet Yoshua, the Israeli author and thinker, famously gave a speech to the National Federation Convention, whatever they call it. I forget what they call it, but about a decade ago, 15 years ago, maybe by now, where he got up and he gave a speech talking about how even the most religiously observant, most dedicated Jews who are totally involved in Jewish life at every part of life in America are leading partial Jewish lives. Whereas the Arab citizen of the state of Israel is living a more Jewishly full life than they are. You can imagine that the people at the Federation hearing were not terribly happy in response to this. But I actually think that Aleph Bet Yoshua was saying something not so dissimilar from what David Hartman is saying right here, which is that he fundamentally understands Judaism not as a religion in the way that maybe Christianity defines the category of religion, but actually as the merging of Jewish values into Jewish power and the politics that emerge from it, right? That if your healthcare coverage is determined by Jewish values, that is a profound statement about how you live and how you exist in the world, and something that we can't necessarily conceive of, right? Or we do sometimes conceive of that, actually. At CRC, I know for a long time, for instance, we had really wonderful healthcare for all of our employees for that reason. It's less possible today, unfortunately, because of the realities of the health insurance marketplace. But did that make sense as a critique? Okay.
So this is sort of simplistic, but is he sort of saying you can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk? I mean, that it's not enough just to study and reflect, that you have to live it and do it and be it?
So yeah, I think the other, here, let me get rid of the screen share for a moment. I think the other framing that he's doing here with Sinai and Auschwitz is he's pointing out that almost every narrative we have for talking about Israel is a narrative of existential crisis. Almost every single narrative is a crisis narrative. It doesn't really matter whether you are on the left or on the right when it comes to Israel, the people who are across the political spectrum, right? So for instance, Israel is going to exist. Israel is on the threat of extinction because of the occupation. It's a crisis narrative of the left, right? Israel has to be supported and can't be questioned. And who are you sitting in your comfortable American seats to question what the Israeli army does when they're the ones having rockets falling on them, and they're the ones who could be wiped out and pushed into the sea at any moment, right? A narrative of existential crisis. In both of those, though, because it's a moment of existential crisis, definitionally, this Auschwitz model of ethics prevails. If you're in existential crisis, survival is the only ethical response. It almost doesn't matter, right? Keep going with all of your models in all the ways that we talked about Israel. American Jewry is assimilating itself into nothing. The only Jewish future is the Jewish state, and therefore we need to protect the Jewish state at all costs. Right? And whatever the ethical implications of what the army does or what the policies of settlement or whatever it does, right? It doesn't matter because of the existential crisis that's happening. And you really can keep going, right? I don't know if anyone else has any other models in your head of the way that Jewish communities, both in America and in Israel, but I actually think this is particularly a critique of America here, talk about Israel. But so many of these lenses are lenses of existential threat and crisis, lenses of Auschwitz. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So not only are those the lenses that are used, they are wrong, right? They're just self-evidently wrong. Whatever it is that you think of Israel, it's not going anywhere. Israel is a vibrant, established state with nuclear power, with amazing cities, with real threats and living in a rough neighborhood. But it is not a place that is in danger of being wiped off the map tomorrow. It's not, right? It's got an amazingly vibrant culture. It's got significant security apparatus to protect them, right? The lens of Auschwitz is not the lens of the reality of the Israeli Jewish experience, nor is it the lens of the American Jewish experience, right? Whatever assimilation looks like and whatever people getting worked up about the continuation of American Jewish identity, the reality is we're living at the golden age. Right? There has never been a better time to have lived as a Jew, right? If anything, maybe we're just off the peak of the golden age, right? Maybe half a generation ago, it was the golden age. But again, right, like in the grand scheme of things, if you were to describe the world we live in, where 3/9 of the Supreme Court, where 10% of Congress are Jewish, where the Secretary of State, where the head of Homeland Security, where who else is Jewish in the Biden administration? There's someone big I'm forgetting. There's Blinken, there's the Attorney General, who should be on the Supreme Court, right? All of these people are Jews. Jews are the leaders of industry and banking and medicine, and right, like you start saying it like this and it almost sounds like it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy, right? I don't know about anyone else. I start saying it, I can like feel the heckles go up on the back of my neck here, right? But regardless, there's no way that you can rationally look at this and think that we are living in Auschwitz and not at Sinai. We are living at a moment of incredible and unprecedented Jewish power and Jewish possibility, with the moral obligations that emerge from having that power. Which is to say it differently, that if you were to go back in time and explain all of this to, the Jews who lived in our great-great-grandparents' generation, they would tell you that we're living in the time of the Messiah, right? That this was our world. They couldn't have conceived of this being our world. And yet, for some really understandable, obvious reasons, our lenses in a post-Holocaust moment, right? Because let's not diminish the reality of the Holocaust, have been so stuck in lenses of existential crisis. So I actually, it's broadly my theory of what went wrong in American Israel education. Right? Everyone's got their what went wrong. And oftentimes it has to do with, we didn't sell the mythology enough, or right, we needed, Israel is always right even more, or it's the opposite, right? We should have been teaching the Nakba and the settlements so that when kids go off to college, they are prepared. To me, I actually think that the big critique is that we have only presented existential lenses for a moment that is not fundamentally existential. our lenses, the way that we talk about Israel and conceive of Israel and think about Israel and discourse about Israel doesn't fit with reality. We are not in an existential moment. And yet it's the only way we often know how to talk. We only know how to speak so often in the language of Auschwitz and not in the language of Sinai. Okay, we didn't actually finish the essay, but I feel like I gave away the end of this essay right here. Thoughts, ideas, responses. What do we think of this? What do we think of Hartman? What do we think of
Daniel, my
Yeah.
wife has something to say.
I just wanted to say that Jewish people have a lot of stuff that go on with them, but also Christian people do too, because Christian people have struggles here in America, but also have struggles elsewhere that are, important to Christians, but don't have as much as others do.
So, right, like I think to fit that into David Hartman's framework, I think understanding our own past of oppression and history and struggle and using it to leverage empathy with other people who are struggling is very much Jewish, right? In fact, he says that over and over again towards the end of this essay. But to take our awfulness that has happened to us and to have it excuse our behavior in this moment, or to excuse the questioning of our behavior in this moment, right? It is, as he's framing it here, an Auschwitz ethic for a moment of Sinai. And it doesn't work because when you're living in Auschwitz, survival is the only ethical response. But when you're living with power, only focusing on your own survival is deeply unethical. Okay, other thoughts, other responses to this?
I've got a couple of thoughts. I have not read this
Yeah.
piece, and I'm grateful that you are sharing it. I agree with parts of it, and I think he's missing the mark on a few others. Yeah, I do agree with the idea that the Jewish nation does not have the right to say that no one has suffered like we have. There's suffering all over the world, and but I don't know that I hear many generations talking about Jews having the monopoly on suffering or acting as if they do. So while I agree with part of what he's saying, I'll take umbrage with some other parts. The other part that
I think you're right. I think that piece is dated, Mitch. I'm with you. I think we can get lost in focusing on a Judaism that is based on Jewish suffering, right? And our claim to morality can become based on that. But yeah, I agree. I think that
right,
you don't hear those words quite in the same way anymore.
No, but even in 1982, I will tell you, I was at college and during this war that was going on, and like any war, if you're on a college campus and you're Jewish or whatever, it's going to be talked about because that's what college kids love to talk about, right? I mean, they all want to fix the world and blame somebody and take a side. Everyone's got to take a side. Now, in 1982, I experienced my reality, my gestalt was that I met many people who had never known what a Jew is, but they hated us anyway. They hated me until they learned I was Jewish. And then it became hard for them to say some of the things they were saying out loud before I said, hey, you know what? I am Jewish. And one person actually said, "Hey, is it true? Do you have small horns on the back of your head?" Now, this is 1982, right? This is the time that I guess this book is being written, and the still at that point, we are coming off as, I don't know that I want to say that we were coming off as having a victim mentality, but I will tell you that even during that time, which was even I guess the halfway point between then and now of the Holocaust, the anti-Semitism was strong, and you didn't have to reach back and say Holocaust like it was Beetlejuice, right? There was enormous anti-Semitism going on there, at least in my world, and from what I could tell, pretty much all over the world. And that, I don't really think that has changed a lot. I think it's unfair to say that those who want to fight against anti-Semitism, or at least have the moral stance that we do have a right to exist without fear, are hearkening back and yelling Beetlejuice. And it's to me, I think it still can have it. There's echoes of minimalization in some of his points of view.
I think late David Hartman would probably agree with much of that critique, actually.
Yeah. And if you try to move some of what you have been talking about to modern day, I do look at the idea that there may not be an existential crisis in terms of, will Israel be wiped off the map? But that isn't for lack of some effort on many people's parts to do just that. So to say, hey, that's old news, stop it, let it go, we're doing fine. Look, we got people in the US that are in positions of power. No offense, Daniel, that's bullshit, because those people aren't there. And there is a threat still that there are people that still want to wipe Israel off the map. And you don't have to be afraid of saying, hey, this is, we got to protect Israel. You got to stop this. And no, we're not just crying wolf and saying Holocaust, Holocaust, don't do it. We have a moral superiority. And it just, at some point, you look to the world to figure out on their own something that the UN can never figure out, that Israel does have a right to exist. And I think there's some really fascinating points in this paper so far that you've read. It's made me want to read the rest of it. And man, there is some powerful things that I really do agree with what he's saying. But I think there's some danger there as well in not giving enough credence to the fear that still exists. So when I say fear, I will tell you that in the early and mid 70s, when I was in Israel with my family, man, there was still fear of what could happen if Israel doesn't make it. Right? I mean, I was in the kibbutz in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and there were conversations at the coffee shops. I was young,
and
but there were people still talking about, are we going to make it in the 70s? To act like Israel, just because they have some smarts and they have technology and power and money now,
and the
think
nuclear
that nuclear weapons. Okay, so they have nuclear weapons. To say that it should be now a completely mature nation is bullshit. We look at the U.S. in its 200 and whatever 70 some years of existence as still a young nation trying to figure itself out, and still the U.S. is triggered by its own Holocaust, which is slavery. And you want to, God forbid, somebody say, hey, stop using slavery as an excuse for what's going on. And you know what? It's old. It happened in the past. Let it go. I mean, that's the equivalent, the moral equivalent of telling Israelis, stop yelling Holocaust, that
No,
you have a more,
I
that
don't
you
think
have a
that's what
moral
he's saying.
superiority. There's a direct correlation, Daniel.
I don't think that's what he's saying. Let me give you a contemporary example, and an example I studied at the Hartman Institute in 2014 when rockets were falling on us, but works for today too, which is Iron Dome. Again, remember that Hartman is an ethicist. His primary concern is what is the ethical thing to do in life and the way to live.
Right.
Do folks know what Iron Dome is? It's
of course.
American financed, Israeli developed defense system against these rockets that are sent in from Hamas. And it has been a game changer. I mean, I remember in 2014 when we were living there, we would hear the sirens go off. We'd grab our kids out of bed. We'd go huddle in the bathroom or in the bomb shelter or wherever it was. And you'd sit and you'd wait for the sound of Iron Dome intercepting the rockets. And as soon as Iron Dome intercepted the rockets, like it was like the soccer team had scored a goal. The whole neighborhood would go up in cheers. And everyone would exhale. So the Iron Dome has radically altered what it is like, what the real world implications of these rockets are. The rockets that Hamas sends terrorize Israelis, right? Terrorize. Gavi didn't sleep through the night for 6 months. And yet it's also incredibly effective. And the Iron Dome basically, not entirely, but basically neutralizes these rockets and a huge percentage of them. And so Hartman's point is that does change the morality, right? It changes the morality of how we have to respond. That when the rockets become things that by and large, instead of destroying us, they destroy our quality of life, it doesn't mean that Israel shouldn't respond or doesn't have a moral obligation to respond, in fact, but it is not an existential threat. It is something different. And Iron Dome changes the morality of that. And what Hartman is arguing, as I understand it, at its core, is that we have to recognize the change in that morality and not continue to exist at a place where the morality of how we respond to these rockets is the same as if we didn't have Iron Dome. Does that make sense? That is his fundamental argument here.
Can I say something real quick? It's almost like a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing to have it because, the destruction would have been unbelievable with 4,000 rockets coming and only a handful basically landed. But it's also a curse because you're blamed. Because when you retaliate, they don't have it and and it'll never stop. And it wasn't just the Palestinians with it. I mean, when the Scud missiles were coming, they were able to stop a lot of those missiles.
So David Hartman is fundamentally uninterested in the question of blame and of being able to place the blame on someone else. He is only interested in what are our own moral obligations and what are our own ethical obligations. And that's pretty different, right? Undoubtedly, right, there were some 200 Palestinians who were killed in this latest awfulness. I don't know if you call it a war or I'm not exactly sure what the right word is for what happened. And there were something like 12 Israelis who died as a result of this. Undoubtedly, without Iron Dome, the Israeli civilian deaths would have been awful, right? And I don't want to minimize the suffering of Israelis who live under these rockets. And yet, the fact that there weren't all of these Israeli civilian deaths is real. And the fact that we have Iron Dome is real, and it changes the moral calculus for ourselves, not the moral calculus of blaming, not the moral calculus of PR, of hasbara, of convincing someone else why we're right, but our own obligations of how we act and respond are changed by the existence of our power and by the elimination of the existential threat. The rockets are not an existential threat as they currently exist, right? Everyone's always playing this game of trying to upgrade their weapons of war. But as they exist, the rockets of Hamas are not an existential threat to Israel, to the quality of life, absolutely, but not to life itself. And the morality, the calculus of morality has to change as a result. That is what I understand is Hartman's fundamental point. It's worth
except
noting
Hartman, Iron Dome wasn't around when Hartman wrote this book, right? It just wasn't there.
No. But the equivalent was in terms of disproportionate power or et cetera, et cetera. The last thing to say, and then I have a little more thoughts, is the Hartman Institute today is the sole purveyor of ethics training to senior officers in the IDF. The same people who taught me this stuff also teach the senior officers in the IDF this stuff, and are hired by the IDF to get their officers to deal with the ethical and moral implications of these things.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
In one room and you look over and it's like senior brass over there, or there were only 25 of us on campus sometimes, and it would be the 25 of us, and there was, CP Livni hanging around, or all these sort of Israeli politicians show up. And okay, other thoughts, other ideas?
Yeah,
Natalie.
there's one problem with the pushing and staying in a situation of perceiving existential crisis. It develops. There's an old Cherokee. Well, actually, all sorts of nations have got the thing. You become what you think about all the time, and if you've got an existential deal, you start becoming paranoid, and you can actually, the existential argument or crisis argument could be made for the people that were doing the Holocaust, because they were in this paranoid status that we've got to do this because the Jews are, and I mean, existential crisis makes people stop thinking in a people, stop seeing people as people. You start seeing everybody as enemies.
Natalie, I think David would have agreed exactly with what you're saying, that fundamentally, I love that framing, that the Nazis saw themselves as ethically being at Auschwitz, with Jews being the danger to them. And that the fundamental ethical danger is when we substitute an Auschwitz frame for a Sinai moment. When the moment calls for aspirational vision of how we should live and what we should do with our power, and instead we convince ourselves that we are living in existential threat and have to survive at all costs. Yeah, that is a great analogy, Natalie.
You had what briefly was the most powerful nation in the world, and they're terrified of everybody, and then they see these people here, which, if you look at the history, like almost a third of the German army in World War I was Jews. They were a vibrant, very important part of the society, of the middle class, but they started becoming paranoid, and they started blaming, and then all of a sudden they became the enemies out of strictly, your term, existential crisis. And the Holocaust was born out of that, and it's stupid.
That's really, I'm gonna keep thinking about that, Natalie. Thank you. That was really interesting. The other sociological piece that I think is worth raising is that, particularly for American Jews who were Gen X or millennials, we grew up being told, particularly folks, I grew up with less of this because I grew up at CRC, which in some ways was a response against this. But broadly, in the American Jewish experience, we grew up generationally being told all about the awful existence of anti-Semitism that was everywhere around us and never encountering it or seeing it. And in fact, the single greatest experience of these generations has been assimilation and intermarriage, right? In the intermarriage rate is evidence of the broad acceptance of Jewish people into the fabric of America, or if we want to frame it with critical race theory, into the fabric of American whiteness. And what's happened is that's no longer true, right? Jews today of basically every generation have experienced or witnessed or encountered, whether it's personally or online or friends or whatever it is, significant anti-Semitism in the United States in the last 5, 6, 7 years, which has changed this whole conversation as well. Okay, other thoughts? Other ideas, other responses?
You know, I'm thinking about what you were just saying about, you know, sort of Gen X and millennials, and thinking back to what Mitch was saying earlier. I mean, I'm sort of more of Mitch's generation where, you know, we grew up, and I mean, I grew up in Berkeley, California. It was a very liberal, very Jewish environment. So, I mean, we never even thought about religion. We thought about race, but we didn't think about religion. And, you know, Israel was great. And if you were lucky, you could go somewhere on a kibbutz. I mean, you know, and it really wasn't until the Vietnam War, I think, that we shifted our mindset about militarism, and that suddenly then the discourse about Israel became a little bit different because militarism maybe wasn't the answer to things. So I think there's a lot of pieces to this fabric. I mean, you've given me a lot of things to think about too. Yeah,
thank you, Nancy. Yeah, absolutely. But the other piece, as long as we're talking the sociology of those moments, is the late 60s, 70s is also the end of the civil rights movement and the rise of identity politics. And so it's the rise of things like the Black Power movement, but it's also the rise of Jewish power movements in the sense that, right, Jews, the 67 war, the 6-day war, this miraculous moment coincided with also a moment where Jews in America were increasingly seeing ourselves in tribal terms, ethnic terms, however you want to frame it, rather than just traditionally religious terms. We see that changing in the 60s at the same time as well. So all of those pieces. And then the anti-militarism, and yeah, thank you. Other thoughts, other reactions to this? Do other people find this to be as searing of a critique of American Judaism, Israeli Judaism, as I do, or is this inside baseball too much?
A lot to think about. It's good to think about.
It's a real eye opener. It's just a discussion in which I've never participated or even sat and heard people discuss. So thank you.
Well, I had mixed parents, one's from Israel, one's from Philadelphia. And like when stuff would go on in Israel, one would react a different way, one would react another way. So it's kind of funny. Like, who's going to say one thing today and who's going to react a different way?
Yeah. There's a whole series of curriculums that are built off of this basic idea called I Engage, that are about adult curriculums, that are about, put out by the Hartman Institute, moving our Israel conversations to discussions of values rather than discussions of politics. It's actually quite powerful. But if anyone's come to any of the sessions that Jim and Carney and Rory and I have done, we did 2 months of sessions. I forget what we called them. Coming together, coming apart, the Zoom things. This essay, Auschwitz or Sinai, very much sits as the unspoken common ground between all four of us. that regardless of our politics and our et cetera, this is sort of the starting premise.
Hey, Daniel, what do you suppose, since you've read much more of this guy's work, the only thing I've read is listening to what you just gave us. Given what you know about his point of view, and you're talking about looking at this through the lens of American Jewry, what do you propose he might think of today's, and I'm going to call it a threat, let's not call it an existential threat, but let's talk about the threat of the very far left, who do seem to, and I don't want to say, well, are anti-Israel, and I'm talking about in our political theater, like all the members of the Squad, and Bernie, who just said, hey, let's put up for debate whether we fund Israel's military anymore, just last week. What do you think his response would be to seeing a new form of anti-Israel, anti-Jewish rhetoric coming out of our political leaders in this country? Let's not talk about how many people are Jewish in Biden's cabinet. Let's talk about what we're now hearing every day of how the progressive left seems to hate Israel. What would he say to that?
So
and I know you're guessing. I'm going to ask you to guess what he would say.
You can get close to it because you can read what Daniel, his son and the head of the Hartman Institute, has said in a number of columns in the Times of Israel. So if you Google Daniel Hartman, you'll find some answers there. I think he would take it really seriously. Two of the initiatives of the Hartman Institute have been to bring, one's called the Christian Leadership Initiative, where they bring particularly liberal Christian clergy, thinkers, academics to come and learn Hartman Torah in Jerusalem. It's a one-way. It's not a dialogue. It's a monologue. They teach them Hartman Torah, with the goal being, you don't have to accept this. We just want you to understand our own narrative of ourselves. And if you want to see what that looks like in practice, you can read Yossi Klein Halevi's Letters to My Palestinian Neighbors. Yossi was involved in the creation of that curriculum. They have a similar program with Muslim leaders in the United States. So they would take it really seriously, I think. But to sort of piggyback on what you're saying, Mitch, one of the interesting in sort of a gross way, things of our moment today is that we're familiar with this idea of anti-Israel, anti-Semitism. But what's happened is now we have folks who are anti-Semitic in their anti-Israelism, but we also have folks who are extremely pro-Israel and anti-Semitic through their Zionism, right? Think about people like Steve Bannon and much of the Trump administration that understood Israel as being like the place that all these Jews should go to, so they're not here, right? Understanding Israel, which it does self-identify at some level as an ethno-state, as a model for an American white ethno-state, where Jews should go. So anyways, there's this really, again, interesting is not quite the right word, but there's this interesting moment we are in where anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have become detached from each other, right?
Right.
You have...
Yeah, absolutely. I have friends that way too.
Right. Yeah. I absolutely, by the way, do not believe that anti-Zionism definitionally is anti-Semitism. Even as there's huge overlaps amongst those who define themselves as anti-Zionist, I think you can be an anti-Zionist who is not anti-Semitic, right? Which is to say that, for instance, I think you can be a Palestinian who opposes the existence of the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic. Or even Jews, right? Also ultra-Orthodox groups, or some of these, right? I genuinely believe that's possible, and it's possible to be deeply Zionist and deeply anti-Semitic. So these things are getting slippier.
It's crazy, isn't it?
I don't know if I have anything else to say there, but yeah, it's a crazy, interesting moment. Okay. Any other thoughts? Any other comments? Any other reactions? So as long as you came to this, a reminder, if you haven't heard it for a while, that we have 2 Israel trips on the books right now for CRC. There's an Israel trip in January, February, as in this coming January, February. And there's an Israel trip next summer. The one this coming January, February is very much a Hartman inspired Israel trip. First of all, we're going to deal with a lot of Hartman content and Hartman people, including we're going to get a walking tour of the 67 War for the Old City by Yossi Klein Halevi. He's going to take us on a walking tour of Like Dreamers. We'll meet with Daniel Estrin, the NPR reporter who's from St. Louis, who you hear reporting from Jerusalem. But we're digging into the reality of Israel as a beautiful, messy, complicated place and taking apart the mythologies so we can understand them rather than diving into the mythologies. So, we're going to go to Hebron. We're going to see what the occupation looks like up close at its worst. But we're going to go there with Breaking the Silence, and we're going to get a tour from the settlers who are there. Tip, the things that the settlers say out loud in some ways are much more horrifying than the things that you'll see, actually. Hearing them talk about what a hero Bruch Goldstein was and things like that, the guy who murdered 29 folks praying in Machpelah back in the 90s, and et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, right, like this multiphonic, multi-vocal perspective of all of those things. We're going to look at the refugees living in South Tel Aviv without status, and look at this as a phenomenon of Israel and how it's being dealt with within Israel. We're going to meet with queer Israeli voices. We're going to look at the divide between Tel Aviv and the rest of the country, and the increasing divide between the Tel Aviv and the rest of the country, as Tel Aviv feels more and more to the people within it as the liberal progressive enclave in a radically rightward tilting, religiously rightward tilting as well, greater country. Maybe we can identify with that being St. Louisans living in Missouri. So anyways, we are going to dig in to the reality of Israel today, with the goal being that we build meaningful, powerful, values-based relationships that are based on this moment. And then the summer trip is going to be a family trip, which will be much more of a classic Israeli trip, though with a clearly CRC bent to it. If anyone's interested, the adult trip that's going January, February will have a 3-day pre-trip also, which is the greatest hits, because we're not doing the greatest hits in the adult trip. So if you want to do like the standard Yad Vashem tour, that we'll problematize it like we did today. And if you want to do the standard Western Wall tour and those sorts of things, Masada, we're specifically not doing Masada. I've made it a life goal to never climb up Masada at dawn. But we have a Masada as part of the pre-trip for folks who haven't done that. But again, we're not going to just go to Masada and have that experience. We're going to take it apart. We're going to talk about the creation of the Masada myth, which it is myth in both of the senses. We mean that in that the Masada story as we know it probably isn't very true. And it's a myth in the sense that the Masada story has been used as a way of teaching Israeli Jews who they are and who they should strive to be, in a way not dissimilar from how the Alamo is, for instance, used in Texas.
Hey, no comments about the Alamo.
Got to watch out for the Texans.
Daniel, who's leading the 2 trips?
Both of them are going to be me and someone else. It's me and Alana, the new rabbinic admin for the adult trip. And it'll be Karen, myself, and our kids on the family trip.
Cool.
Yeah. I'm so excited for both of these trips. Particularly the adult trip has just a really incredible itinerary between Yossi and Hebron, and all of it is, yeah.
So if we're not able to make it, is it going to be virtual?
It will not be virtual. It will not be virtual, unfortunately. However, we will, leading up to it, do a lot of Israel education as we were doing beforehand, and that'll be open to anyone who wants to be a part of it. And we'll use a lot of Hartman content for that.
Very cool.
And anyone who's thinking that you're interested, I should just say up front, it's about $5,500 a person, inclusive of everything: airfare, bus, tour guide, hotels, etc. For a 10-day trip. Just about 2,000 of that, 1,500 of that is the airfare. Okay. Any last thoughts?
No.
This was great. It was wonderful to learn with y'all.